The shouting started before sunrise. At first, it was just a distant argument drifting through the quiet neighborhood streets. But within minutes, voices grew louder, angrier, sharper, until the entire block could hear the confrontation unfolding outside number 17. No one expected the police to be involved. And yet, by the end of that morning, flashing red and blue lights would dominate the street, neighbors would gather on sidewalks whispering in disbelief, and a conflict that had quietly simmered for months would finally explode into something no one could ignore. It began with something small. At least, that's what everyone thought. For weeks, tension had been building between two neighbors, Mark Turner and Diane Collins. Their homes stood directly across from each other, separated by a narrow street and years of silent resentment. Mark had moved into the neighborhood just 6 months earlier. He was quiet, kept mostly to himself, and worked long hours. Diane, on the other hand, had lived there for nearly 15 years and believed she knew how the neighborhood should run. From the moment Mark arrived, things felt off to her. It started with complaints. First, Diane insisted Mark parked his truck too close to the curb. Then she said his trash bins were placed incorrectly. Soon she was knocking on his door every few days, pointing out new violations she claimed were ruining the neighborhood. Mark tried to stay polite at first, but patience has limits. One evening, Diane confronted him again while he was unloading groceries. Her voice carried across the street as she accused him of ignoring community rules. Mark finally snapped. "What rules?" he asked, frustration spilling into his voice. Diane crossed her arms. "The rules that keep this neighborhood respectable." Neighbors peeked through windows. Arguments between them became more frequent after that. Small issues turned into loud confrontations. Parking spaces, lawn maintenance, noise complaints, every minor disagreement grew into something bigger. People began avoiding the tension. Until that morning, when Diane marched across the street holding a stack of papers and started shouting before Mark had even finished opening his front door. Within seconds, the argument escalated. Voices rose, accusations flew, and someone, no one knew exactly who, picked up their phone and dialed the police. Because this time, something felt different. This time, the tension wasn't just loud. It was dangerous. The neighbors who watched from their windows could already sense that whatever happened next would change the neighborhood forever. And in the distance, faint but unmistakable, the sound of approaching sirens began to echo through the quiet streets. The sound of the sirens grew louder with every passing second. At first, most neighbors hoped the argument would cool down before the police arrived. Disputes had happened before in the neighborhood, and usually they ended with slammed doors and angry muttering. But this time felt different. The tension in the air was thick, almost electric, like a storm about to break. Mark stood on his front porch, gripping the railing tightly. His face was flushed with frustration as Diane continued waving the papers in her hand like evidence in a courtroom. "These are official complaints," Diane shouted. "I've documented everything, every violation, every disturbance, every time you've ignored the community standards." Mark shook his head in disbelief. "You've been spying on me for weeks," he replied sharply. "This isn't about rules. This is about you trying to control everyone around here." Several neighbors had now stepped outside. Some pretended to check their mail while quietly listening. Others stood on their lawns, whispering to each other as the argument escalated. Diane's voice cut through the street again. "You don't belong here, Mark. People like you ruin neighborhoods like this." The words hung heavily in the air. Mark took a step forward, anger flashing across his face. "People like me, what exactly is that supposed to mean?" For a moment, no one spoke. Even Diane seemed caught off guard by the weight of what she had just implied. Then she doubled down. "It means people who think they can move in and ignore how things are done here." Mark laughed bitterly. "I follow every rule. The only problem here is you." That was when the first police car turned onto the street. The flashing lights reflected off windows and parked cars as the vehicle slowed to a stop near the two houses. A second patrol car followed just moments later. The neighborhood fell into an uneasy silence. 2 officers stepped out of their vehicles, immediately assessing the situation. One approached Mark while the other walked toward Diane, holding a calm but firm posture. "All right," one officer said, raising his voice just enough to command attention. Let's take a step back and figure out what's going on here. Diane immediately began speaking over Mark, explaining her complaints in rapid bursts of frustration. He's been violating neighborhood rules for months. I've reported everything. I have proof. Someone needs to do something about him. Mark rubbed his temples, exhausted. Officer, I've done nothing wrong. She's been harassing me since the day I moved in. The officer glanced at the papers Diane was holding. Ma'am, he said calmly, we're going to need everyone to lower their voices. But Diane wasn't finished. Lower my voice. This man is destroying our community. The officer's expression hardened slightly. Across the street, neighbors watched silently, realizing that this was no longer just a disagreement between two people. The police were now involved. And what they were about to uncover would make the entire neighborhood rethink everything they thought they knew. The street had gone almost completely silent. Neighbors who had stepped outside earlier now stood frozen in place, watching the scene unfold like an unexpected drama. The flashing police lights reflected off windows and parked cars, casting red and blue shadows across the quiet neighborhood. Officer Ramirez took the papers from Diane and began scanning them carefully. There were pages of notes, dates, times, photographs printed from a home printer. Each page listed another incident Diane had recorded about Mark since the day he moved in. Parking violations, noise complaints, trash bins placed incorrectly, even the exact time Mark turned on his porch light at night. Officer Ramirez slowly flipped through the stack, his eyebrows tightening slightly with every page. Ma'am, he said calmly, you've been documenting your neighbor for months. Diane straightened her posture proudly. Someone has to keep standards around here. Across the sidewalk, Officer Miller was speaking quietly with Mark. Have you received any official warnings from the homeowners association? He asked. Mark shook his head immediately. None. Not a single one. I've asked them several times if there were complaints, and they said everything was fine. Officer Miller glanced toward Diane, then back at Mark. And she's been confronting you regularly. Almost every week, Mark said. Sometimes more. Officer Miller nodded slowly. Meanwhile, Officer Ramirez continued reading the papers Diane had prepared. Something about them clearly bothered him. Finally, he looked up. Ma'am, did the WA ask you to collect this information? Diane hesitated for the first time since the police arrived. Well, no, she admitted. But someone had to take responsibility. The officer placed the papers back into her hands. I understand wanting to maintain your neighborhood, he said carefully. But documenting and confronting someone repeatedly can sometimes create unnecessary conflict. Diane's face flushed red. So now I'm the problem. She snapped. No, the officer replied calmly. But escalating situations like this often makes things worse. Across the street, a few neighbors exchanged glances. Many of them had quietly witnessed Diane's confrontations before. Some had even experienced them themselves over the years, though none had ever reported it. Officer Miller walked back toward Ramirez after speaking with Mark. Everything checks out on his end, he said quietly. Ramirez nodded. He then turned back to Diane. Ma'am, from what we can see, there's no immediate violation here that requires police action. Diane's eyes widened. You're kidding. No, ma'am. Her voice rose again, louder than before. So you're just going to ignore everything I've documented? The officers exchanged another look. Officer Ramirez spoke carefully. These appear to be personal disputes, not criminal issues. That answer clearly wasn't what Diane wanted to hear. Her frustration boiled over instantly. This is unbelievable, she shouted. You're all letting him get away with ruining this neighborhood. Mark took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. But the tension was rising again. And what Diane did next would shock everyone watching. Because in that moment of anger, she revealed something that would completely change the direction of the entire situation. Diane's frustration had reached its limit. For a moment, it looked like she might simply storm back into her house and slam the door. But instead, she took a deep breath and pointed directly at Mark again, her voice shaking with anger. You don't understand, she said loudly. I have proof of much worse things. The words instantly caught everyone's attention. Both officers turned toward her. Officer Ramirez narrowed his eyes slightly. What kind of proof? Diane lifted her chin, clearly believing she had just revealed the final piece of a winning argument. Security footage, she declared. Weeks of it. The street went quiet again. Officer Miller frowned. Security footage of what exactly? Of him, Diane replied, pointing again at Mark. Every time he breaks the rules. Mark stared at her, stunned. You've been recording me? He asked. Diane didn't hesitate. Of course I have. Someone had to. A murmur spread quietly among the neighbors who were still watching. Recording small portions of your own property for security was normal. Many homes had doorbell cameras or driveway cameras. But the way Diane said it made the officers pause. Officer Ramirez spoke carefully. Ma'am, where exactly are these cameras located? Diane pointed proudly toward the corner of her roof. I installed 3 cameras last month. One facing the street, one facing my driveway, and one pointed directly toward his house so I could catch every violation. Mark's expression changed instantly. You pointed a camera at my house, he said slowly. Officer Miller's tone became more serious. Ma'am, cameras that monitor your own property are generally fine. But intentionally aiming surveillance equipment at a neighbor's private areas can raise legal concerns. Diane waved her hand dismissively. Oh please, it's just the front of his house. But Officer Ramirez had already taken a step back to examine the roof where the camera was mounted. From where he stood, the angle was clear. The camera wasn't just facing the street. It was pointed almost directly at Mark's front yard and windows. The officer exchanged a quiet look with his partner. Meanwhile, the neighbors watching from their driveways were whispering more openly now. Many of them had seen Diane installing the cameras weeks earlier. At the time, most assumed she simply wanted extra security. Now the purpose seemed very different. Officer Ramirez turned back toward Diane. Ma'am, do you have access to the footage right now? Diane nodded quickly. Yes, I can show you everything. She marched toward her front door, clearly expecting the officers to follow and finally see the evidence she believed would prove Mark was the real problem. The officers walked slowly behind her. Mark remained on the sidewalk, still trying to process what he had just learned. But as the police stepped toward Diane's house to review the recordings, none of them realized that what they were about to see on those cameras would raise far more questions than answers. And within minutes, the situation would take a turn no one on that street had expected. Diane pushed open her front door with confidence, motioning for the officers to follow her inside. This way, she said quickly. I'll show you everything. Officer Ramirez and Officer Miller stepped into the house, glancing around as they entered. The living room was neat but crowded with shelves, paperwork, and stacks of labeled folders. It looked less like a home and more like a command center. Diane walked straight to a desk against the wall where a large computer monitor displayed several camera feeds. There, she said, pointing proudly at the screen. Camera 1, Camera 2, and Camera 3. The officers leaned slightly closer. One camera showed her driveway. Another covered the street, but the third camera immediately caught their attention. The image was zoomed toward Mark's property across the street. Officer Ramirez folded his arms. How long has this been running? He asked. Diane clicked through folders on the computer. I started recording about 5 weeks ago, she explained. Every day, 24 hours. Officer Miller raised an eyebrow. 24 hours. Yes, Diane replied confidently. That way he can't hide anything. She opened a video clip. The footage showed Mark walking out of his front door early one morning, carrying a trash bag toward the curb. Diane paused the video. See that, she said. Trash placed 3 inches outside the designated spot. The officers exchanged a quiet glance. Diane clicked another clip. Mark backing his truck into his driveway. Look at that parking job, she said quickly. His truck crossed the driveway line. Another clip. Mark watering his lawn. Watering too early in the morning, Diane insisted. That's against neighborhood standards. Officer Miller slowly rubbed his chin. Most of the clips showed ordinary daily routines. Nothing illegal, nothing dangerous, just a man living his life. Officer Ramirez leaned slightly closer to the screen and noticed something else. Ma'am, he said carefully, do you have footage that shows something more serious than these minor complaints? Diane hesitated. Well, not exactly serious, she admitted. But it proves he doesn't respect the neighborhood. Officer Miller glanced at Ramirez again. Then Ramirez asked another question. Can you show us the camera placement outside? Diane nodded and led them back outside. She pointed up proudly toward the roof. But the moment the officers stepped back onto the sidewalk, something became even clearer. The camera wasn't just angled toward Mark's yard. It had a direct view of his front windows. Officer Miller looked back at Diane. "Ma'am, did you realize this camera captures footage through your neighbor's windows?" Diane's confident expression faded slightly. "Well, maybe a little," she admitted. "But that's not what I was looking for." The officer's tone became more serious. Recording inside someone's home, even accidentally, can be a legal issue. Across the street, Mark had been waiting quietly the entire time. But now he stepped forward. "You've been filming my house for weeks?" he asked, disbelief in his voice. Diane opened her mouth to respond. But before she could say another word, Officer Ramirez spoke firmly. "Ma'am, we may need to review this situation more carefully." Because what had started as a neighborhood argument was now beginning to look like something very different. And the realization was just starting to sink in. The quiet street suddenly felt heavier. Neighbors who had been watching from their driveways were now standing closer together, whispering among themselves as the situation shifted in a direction no one had expected. Officer Ramirez kept his eyes on the camera mounted on Diane's roof. From where he stood, the angle left little doubt. The lens pointed directly across the street toward Mark's home. Officer Miller spoke next, his tone calm but firm. "Ma'am, how often do you review this footage?" Diane crossed her arms defensively. "Whenever I need to," she replied. "Usually every evening." Mark stared at her in disbelief. "So you've been watching my house every night?" he asked. Diane immediately shook her head. "No, I watch for violations." But the distinction didn't seem to help her case. Officer Ramirez turned back toward the camera. "Does this system record audio as well?" he asked. Diane hesitated again. "Yes," she admitted. "It records everything." The officers exchanged a serious look. Audio surveillance without consent could be far more problematic than simple video recording. Officer Miller spoke carefully. "Ma'am, recording audio from private conversations on someone else's property can raise legal concerns, depending on how it's done." Diane's frustration immediately returned. "So now I'm the one in trouble," she snapped. "All I did was try to protect this neighborhood." No one answered right away. Across the street, several neighbors shifted uncomfortably. Many of them had lived beside Diane for years. They knew she could be strict about neighborhood standards, but none of them realized how far she had taken things. Mark ran a hand through his hair. "This explains a lot," he said quietly. Officer Ramirez turned toward him. "What do you mean?" Mark sighed. "For weeks I've felt like someone was watching. Lights would turn on in her house whenever I came outside at night. Sometimes she'd confront me about things that happened only minutes earlier." He gestured toward the camera. "Now it makes sense." Diane looked furious. "You're twisting everything," she shouted. Officer Miller raised a hand slightly. "Let's keep our voices down." But Diane was too angry to stop. This man moved in and started ignoring every rule we've had for years. Someone had to do something. Mark shook his head slowly. "I followed every rule. You just kept inventing new ones." The tension rose again. But this time, the officers didn't let the argument spiral. Officer Ramirez stepped forward, his voice steady. "Right now, our priority is determining whether any privacy laws may have been violated." The words hit the street like a sudden shift in the wind. Neighbors exchanged surprised glances. Just 30 minutes earlier, Diane had called the police hoping they would punish Mark. Now the conversation had completely changed direction. Officer Miller pulled out a small notepad. "We'll need to document the camera placement and the recording system," he said. Diane's confidence was fading quickly. "You're not seriously investigating me," she said. But the officers didn't answer immediately. Because the situation had clearly moved beyond a simple neighborhood dispute. And what they discovered next would make the entire block realize just how serious things had become. The atmosphere on the street had completely changed. What started as a loud neighborhood argument had now turned into a quiet investigation. The flashing lights from the patrol cars still reflected across the houses, but the shouting had stopped. Instead, everyone was listening. Officer Miller finished writing notes while Officer Ramirez slowly walked across the street toward Mark's house. "I'd like to check something," Ramirez said. Mark nodded. Sure. They stood near Mark's front porch, looking back toward Diane's roof where the camera was mounted. From that angle, the view was even clearer than before. The lens had a direct line toward Mark's living room window. Ramirez sighed quietly. That camera covers more than just the street, he said. Mark folded his arms. I told you, he replied. She's been watching everything. Across the road, Diane stood near her driveway, trying to maintain a confident posture, but her nervous glances toward the officers revealed that she was beginning to realize how serious the situation had become. Officer Miller joined Ramirez again. We should probably take photos of the setup, he said quietly. Ramirez nodded. He took out his phone and documented the position of the camera from several angles. Meanwhile, the neighbors had formed a loose group on the sidewalk. Some of them were now openly discussing things they had seen over the past few months. One woman finally spoke up. She asked me last week if I noticed when Mark came home at night, the neighbor said softly. Another man nodded. She asked me something similar, he added. I thought she was just curious. Those quiet comments caught the office's attention. Ramirez approached the small group. Has anyone else noticed unusual behavior involving the cameras? He asked. A few neighbors hesitated. Then one older man raised his hand slightly. I saw her adjusting the camera several times, he said. Each time she pointed it more toward Mark's house. Diane immediately stepped forward. That's not true, she insisted. But the man shrugged. I'm just saying what I saw. The tension returned instantly. Officer Miller raised his voice just enough to calm the situation. Everyone relax. We're simply gathering information. But the direction of the conversation was now impossible to ignore. Diane's attempt to prove Mark was the problem had backfired. The focus had shifted. Now the officers were examining her actions instead. Ramirez returned to the patrol car and spoke briefly into his radio. After a moment, he walked back toward the group. We're going to document everything and forward it for further review, he said. Diane looked stunned. Review, she repeated. Yes, Ramirez replied calmly. Situations involving surveillance and privacy can require additional evaluation. The words felt heavy in the quiet neighborhood. Mark remained silent, watching everything unfold. For months he had been the one feeling accused and pressured. Now, suddenly, the truth was coming into the open. But just when it seemed the situation might settle down, something unexpected happened. One of the neighbors spoke up again. And what they revealed next would shock everyone standing on that street. For a moment, no one spoke. The officers had just finished documenting the camera placement when a quiet voice from the group of neighbors broke the silence. I think there's something else you should know. Everyone turned toward the speaker. It was Mrs. Alvarez, an older woman who had lived in the neighborhood for more than 20 years. She rarely involved herself in conflicts, which made people listen when she did speak. Officer Ramirez stepped closer. What is it, ma'am? Mrs. Alvarez glanced nervously toward Diane before answering. A few weeks ago, she said slowly, Diane came to my house asking if my security camera recorded the street. Diane immediately interrupted. That's irrelevant. But Mrs. Alvarez continued. She asked if I could give her copies of my recordings whenever Mark left his house. The words sent a ripple through the crowd. Officer Miller's eyebrows lifted. Did you provide those recordings? He asked. Mrs. Alvarez shook her head firmly. No, I told her I wasn't comfortable doing that. Across the street, Diane's face tightened. You're exaggerating, she said quickly. But the damage was already done. Another neighbor stepped forward. She asked me something similar, he admitted. She wanted to know if my doorbell camera could see Mark's driveway. The officers exchanged another glance. The pattern was becoming clearer. Officer Ramirez spoke carefully. Ma'am, he said to Diane, were you asking neighbors to help monitor Mr. Turner? Diane's frustration exploded again. I was trying to protect this neighborhood. She snapped. Someone had to make sure the rules were followed. But the explanation didn't sound convincing anymore. Mark stood quietly near his driveway, shaking his head. So you tried to turn the entire street into a surveillance team? He asked. Diane didn't respond. Officer Miller closed his notepad. All right, he said calmly. We've gathered enough information for now. Diane looked stunned. You're not doing anything about him? She demanded. Ramirez's answer was direct. At this point, we haven't seen evidence that Mr. Turner has committed any violation requiring police action. The words seemed to drain the remaining confidence from Diane's posture. But Ramirez continued. However, the surveillance situation you described may need further review. Neighbors exchanged surprised looks. The entire confrontation had completely reversed direction. What Diane believed would expose Mark had instead raised serious questions about her own behavior. Officer Miller returned to the patrol car to finish the report. The flashing lights continued to reflect across the quiet houses. Mark finally exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time that morning. But as the officers prepared to leave, Diane said one last thing, something that made the entire street fall silent again. Because the words she spoke next would trigger a final twist no one had seen coming. The officers were just about to return to their patrol cars when Diane suddenly spoke again. "Wait," she said loudly. Everyone turned. The tension that had briefly eased returned immediately. Diane stepped forward, her face flushed with frustration, but there was something different in her voice now, less anger, more desperation. "You can't just leave like this," she said. "You don't understand what he's been doing." Officer Ramirez paused beside the patrol car door. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "we've reviewed the information available today." But Diane shook her head quickly. "No, you haven't seen everything." Mark sighed quietly from across the street. "We've been through this already," he said. "There's nothing else." But Diane raised her hand toward the house behind her. "You don't know the whole story," she insisted. For a brief moment, the entire street held its breath. Then Diane continued. "I started watching him because something felt wrong." Officer Miller crossed his arms. "What exactly felt wrong?" he asked. Diane hesitated. The confident tone she had used earlier was gone. "Late at night," she said slowly, "there were always cars stopping near his house. Different cars. Different people." Mark looked confused. "What are you talking about?" But Diane pointed toward the street. "I thought it was suspicious. That's why I started documenting everything." The officers exchanged a glance. Ramirez stepped closer again. "Ma'am, did you report those concerns to the police before installing surveillance?" Diane looked down. "No," she admitted. "Why not? I wanted proof first." The street fell quiet once more. Officer Miller sighed. "Even if you had concerns, recording your neighbor and monitoring his home isn't the correct way to handle it." Mark shook his head slowly. "Those cars were my coworkers," he explained. "We carpool for the night shift at the hospital." Several neighbors nodded in realization. They had seen those cars too, but none of them had ever assumed anything suspicious. Diane's shoulders slowly dropped. The truth was finally impossible to ignore. Everything that had happened over the past weeks, the cameras, the accusations, the arguments, had been built on suspicion rather than facts. Officer Ramirez closed his notebook. "Sometimes misunderstandings grow when people stop talking and start assuming," he said. Diane didn't respond. For the first time that morning, she seemed completely unsure of what to say. The officers returned to their patrol cars, the flashing lights finally shutting off. Neighbors slowly began returning to their homes. The street that had been filled with shouting, tension, and accusations only an hour earlier was quiet
Mark
again.
looked across the street one last time before heading back toward his front door. No victory, no celebration, just relief that the truth had finally come out and a neighborhood that would never look at that conflict same way again. If you enjoyed the, don't forget to subscribe to Karen Universe, share with your friends and drop your thoughts in the comments.